The information shared in this podcast and related media is intended to provide broad consumer understanding and knowledge of healthcare topics as they pertain to remote work. All content herein is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Further, this information should not be used in place of a visit, call, consultation, or advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. The owners of this content do not recommend the self-management of health problems. Should you have any healthcare-related questions, please call or see your physician or other healthcare provider promptly. You should never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard on this podcast or read in related media. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor, seek professional help, or call 911 immediately.
Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast Mental Health Series. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. The purpose of this series is to destigmatize the mental health issues commonly found in the remote work community. We have partnered with doctors, therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals for a series of in-depth discussions on a broad range of topics, ranging from isolation and depression to crafting meaningful relationships with others, and maybe more importantly, with ourselves. Our guest experts will share their insights in order to arm teams and leaders with the tools they need to thrive now and in the future. Mental health has always been a relevant issue for remote workers, freelancers, and distributed teams. But in today's climate, the subject is becoming more and more pertinent each and every day. I look forward to sharing this valuable information with you, and please join the conversation online, on the socials, or wherever the audience most suited to hear it can get involved. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by TeamMadeApart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. Hi there, and welcome back to the Team Made Apart podcast Mental Health Series. Today's special guest is Charle Peck. Charle has more than 15 years of experience in education and mental health research. Currently, she is working as a high school teacher delivering mental health curriculum to her students at very vulnerable times in their lives. She collaborates with education leaders and mental health professionals to deliver school-based support for those in need. Charle uses valuable clinical therapy tools and approaches with clients and has specialized training in trauma-informed practice. Additionally, she is the host of the Advancing Humanity podcast, where she highlights the contributions people are making towards a thriving human existence. Here for a discussion on the infusion of mental health practices in the education system and at work, understanding how trauma manifests itself in behavior, suicide prevention, and so much more, join me in welcoming to the show, Charle Peck. Hey Charle, how are you? Welcome to the show. I am so glad to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, let's talk a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your background. Compared to some of the other guests that we've had on, you have a strong background in education, which isn't as common with some of these other mental health practitioners that we've come across. So I think you'll have some interesting insights for us. Can you talk a little bit about just sort of who you are, where you come from, and what you do?
Yeah, you know what? I have been in education for about 18 years. I started off in the elementary and then made my way up to high school. And I've worked mostly with teens and young adults. But what I did is I understood the need for mental health, and we've been trying for years to infuse mental health in education. I just feel like we need to do more, and I wanted to be a part of that. And I think that I just have some of that unique vision as an educator and a mental health professional when I try to reach other people on a massive scale. That's the idea. I think people will appreciate that lens. And by the way, I'm a mom of a teenager and of 2 other boys. So I think we all just need to be having this conversation. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's critical. And also it's one of these things that, it was a perspective I hadn't really thought of in some of our other conversations. But we talk about mental health issues and things like that, at least, in remote work, as kind of, almost in a vacuum, like, oh, just, you were fine yesterday and all of a sudden you have a mental health issue. But, now speaking with you or having this different perspective of somebody who's been working with young adults and people who are sort of growing up and developing, I think it's probably clear that a lot of these mental health issues actually start much younger than we think. Maybe they're manifest later as remote work, in the form of, depression or isolationism or whatever else you might suffer with. But I think it's probably true that most of this stuff starts younger than we think.
It absolutely does. And people have probably heard of the ACEs study that was done out of California that the CDC has now jumped aboard with and is now educating other people about it. So there's trauma-based. I actually just finished my certification in certified trauma practitioner for education, because trauma does affect 50% of children in the United States. And some of it's very serious. And so it starts early, and there's something that sticks with them. It's called implicit memory. So it may not show up in their thoughts and their everyday conversation, but their body remembers it. And so early on with little kids, it shows up in behaviors. That's how they're communicating. Sometimes their life just kind of goes through, and then it manifests more as a teenager. And a lot of mental illnesses actually don't manifest until the teen years or young adult years, because it's about the brain. It's all brain-based. We have so much science to back it up. And for people who are trying to hire our youth, they need to understand that some of these don't manifest till the late teen years, depending on your gender and depending on life experiences. So it benefits everybody to learn about it. There's a lot of information we have now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even one of the insights that I've come across lately, and it sounds so dumb to even say it out loud, but I've heard a few different people talking about this, but it's this idea that so many of us sort of view mental health issues like the brain is this independent being and it's doing its own thing, and then you've got your body over here doing whatever it's doing, instead of sort of looking at us as one whole thing. So I think it's really critical to talk about sort of development, not just as your brain's growing, but as your body's experiencing different things and all these different, things that you're going through in development. Do you have any thoughts about sort of the body's role in mental health?
Absolutely. The body is the way that it's communicated to externally and internally. So think about times where you felt stressed. You try to put words to it, but the words may not come out the way you wanted because it affects this part of the brain called the Broca's area. And that's how we communicate through language. But it gets kind of hijacked when you're experiencing toxic stress or something really stressful. So your nervous system, which is of course brain-based, right? Your nervous system is all through your body. So you might have like a tight jaw or a tight chest. And that's why we're trying to teach people to breathe. Well, some people are like, yeah, right, that doesn't work. It doesn't maybe work for everybody, but there's a reason that we're trying to slow down the system, the stress system in your brain, because it's all based in your brain. The body just has the nervous system throughout it. And that's, again, how it communicates externally and internally. So people who they internalize their stress, they might be the ones becoming depressed and have anxiety. And the people who are externalizing that stress are the ones who are becoming more aggressive. They maybe have more conflict with other people interpersonally. So it is showing up. We just have to learn to pay attention to it.
Well, I think so much of it is that, right? Just kind of paying attention. I think it's really easy, especially once you enter the workforce. And, of course, for people working through high school, and that is your job essentially, or ostensibly, it's really difficult to stop and smell the roses, for example. It's hard to stop and take a breath because you're busy. You are feeling overwhelmed with all the things that are coming in. And especially as you're leaving high school and beginning, I guess, kind of a quote unquote real life, and you start, moving into the workforce and things like that. It very easily to become overwhelmed. And I think that it's critical that people pay a little bit more attention.
Yeah, and it's important for leaders. So if you're someone who's considering remote learning for your employees, it could absolutely benefit someone who has anxiety being at work. And even though we're like, oh, somebody has anxiety being at work or among other people, but you don't know why. And so what we need to do is be curious about, well, what's going on? Instead of saying what's wrong with someone, you need to ask the question, well, what happened to that person? Or what's happening. I mean, some of these leaders in these positions of managing other employees need to understand that some of their employees go back to domestic violence situations. They might show up at work pleasant and compliant and seemingly happy and joyful, but they might be going into a really toxic relationship that they're not going to tell you about. So I think leaders need more mental health training, and they need to normalize it, because if we don't normalize it, people aren't going to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's another critical point. And I think we've come a long way in maybe the last 10 or 20 years in terms of, normalization and starting to break down some stigma around mental health. But like you mentioned, this person isn't going to just come out and say that they've had, some sort of physical abuse or whatever their story might be, and that sort of is still stigma around this, right? We're not totally comfortable talking about everything with everybody. And so I think the more trained or the better educated our leaders can be, the better off we'll be. They'll better be able to navigate those seas, I guess. I do want to talk a little bit more about just sort of this trauma-based idea. I think when people hear something like trauma, they probably assume violence or something like that. But I think there's sort of shades of gray when it comes to trauma and what actually might traumatize somebody. And I wanted to talk about that sort of as it relates to sort of resiliency and building sort of a ability to bounce back. I think now, and I'm sure it's wildly offensive to young people, so I haven't been called a snowflake myself, but I know that this is some vernacular that people are throwing around for this younger generation who seem kind of soft, and maybe, maybe resilience is the word that's missing. This is something that I guess they're being accused of not having. And so I wondered if you talk a little bit about it, because I think it's a little bit generational, especially for older people. I mean, I just turned 40, so I'm not like an old man or anything, but, even sort of back in my generation, it was still, a lot of grit, just shut up, put your head down, do the work, that kind of thing, and I don't know that that's right, but I think it did sort of set you up to be better able to, I guess, bounce back when things go wrong. And it seems like maybe this is a characteristic or a set of characteristics that are missing from younger generations, maybe because life has been pretty good, really, or I don't know where it comes from. But I wondered if you had any perspectives on sort of just, first of all, help us understand better trauma, what that might mean for people, and then as that pertains to building resiliency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, trauma is, like you said, there's some gray areas there, but ultimately it's about somebody feeling threatened, that their well-being is not okay. Like they're not going to be okay. And this can be a real experience, or if they perceive it to be a threat to their well-being. And that's what's so different. So somebody who is really afraid of water and going on a boat, if you're like, oh my gosh, suck it up, get on the boat, let's go. And, we'll come back to resiliency there, because we absolutely need to build those skills so people can enjoy life. They're absolutely connected. But you don't really know what that person's connection to that situation is. And sometimes they don't remember that something went wrong, but they could have been 1 or 2 years old. There's science to back this up. That implicit memory is there. They don't know why, because they can't really think. They can't use their cerebral cortex, that thinking part of their brain, to make sense of it. But their body is responding to, nope, there's a threat. I can't do this. Well, there is absolutely ways we can help them through it, through exposure therapy, lots of different ways we can support them. Resiliency is a piece of it. But I have been in education for 18 years, and I have seen the shift, the generational shift. And you're right, because I'm about your age as well. And we were told to suck it up. And the problem with that is, at what cost? So there was a cost in that. So we became shamed, isolated. We had problems in our relationships because of it. And I think that we've been trying to build resiliency, but we just haven't gotten it right. And so those kids that went through that, and I've seen it. I'm a part of the whole, we need to build resilience better. It's because we didn't do it properly. I think we let them get away with avoidance, or we tried to make everyone feel okay all the time, instead of sitting with the discomfort and learning to manage that and empower them with tools to manage it in a safe space. And that's where we need to go with this whole trauma approach, that I think every single person who works with kids or even people like doctors don't have this information. Social workers don't all have this information. Teachers certainly need it, but employers need this. Employers need to understand the trauma lens, because they'll be able to understand, instead of judging or stigmatizing people that are working for them, especially this young generation, they have to be able to approach them in a way that's going to validate what's happening, but also build them up so that they can be great employees for them.
Yeah, I think, and you mentioned it sort of, in passing earlier on, but I mean, it's true that this trauma, and I love your differentiation, the real or perceived, like it's all still real to that individual. The way that trauma influences our behavior at work, I guess as an employer, if you're better able to recognize these issues or better able to go, okay, well, this is, a behavior that's congruent with some sort of trauma in the past. So maybe as an employer, you're better able to help that person navigate, or better to, make that person sort of live out their best, be their best self, I guess. And so I love this idea of, understanding trauma-influenced behavior, because I think, a lot of us are quick to sort of get judgy when it comes to this kind of thing. Like a silly kind of, throwaway example I can think of is like with my sister-in-law, right? She's, great swimmer, good in the water, all this stuff, but she won't get in like a natural body of water, like a lake or something, for fear of the fish underneath, the stuff that she can't see, right? I mean, of course, this trout is not going to hurt her. She's in no danger of, a grouper or something. But at the same time, for whatever reason, there's something in her that bothers, that's a problem for her. And so for us, we're quick to go, oh, come on, stop being a baby, blah, 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 push through it. And I think this is that sort of generational gap that you were talking about, where, it's a little bit suck it up and just do it anyway, even though it sucks, and maybe there's something to that in terms of developing some resilience or whatever, but she's a little older than me and she's not got it yet. So I would say that that's not an effective approach, probably, this idea of belittling or berating people into being better. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit just about sort of, I guess, from an employer's perspective, how one might start to recognize some trauma-influenced behavior, like what sorts of behaviors are common from people, and I imagine there's a pretty broad spectrum, but maybe you can give us just a little guidance on that front.
Yeah, there is a broad spectrum depending on lots, like personality and age. Age is a big deal. And some of it is gender socialized, so we have to watch that. But what I would suggest to leaders is to look at the patterns. So you have to really get to know your employees. So you have to be great at relationships, I think, if you're going to be any good leader in any sector of the work environment. And so if you know your employees, you'll be able to tell that there's a shift in their behavior. And that's what we look for as therapists, is a shift in affect or a shift in a pattern of behavior. Teachers look for this too. This is what you get good at when you get to know people. And so if you know someone who has been showing up to work all the time, they're really engaged, and then they start withdrawing or they start being absent more, those are obvious symptoms that something's going on, something's different, right? And it may not be trauma-based, but if somebody is a great employee and then they start not being a great employee, why? Like, I wonder what's happening to them. Get curious about it. That's what they should be doing. But we do get judgy. So we're like, oh, they're absent again. And you get pissed off and you're like, forget it. I'm so annoyed with them. But if we just shifted our mindset to understand it, and it would be so much better. But listen, I'm not saying to people, if you have someone who claims they have anxiety all the time and it's annoying to you and they're using it, like, I think that's the mindset we all have is, well, they're just going to use it and exploit it and then use me and take these sick days and I can't trust them. But I do think that if we go in and we validate, because think about how that person has experienced the world when there's a huge stigma around it. They've coped in a negative way, most likely, around that, and they might escape. So you've heard of the whole fight, flight, or freeze, sometimes faint if the trauma is really bad. But everybody has fight, flight, or freeze when there's stress. It's a way that our brain responds. So some people just won't talk and they'll just be compliant. And guess what? Leaders like that. We like when people are compliant with us, like parents, like teachers. But that's not always the best from your employee. So it just depends, right? It depends what their baseline behavior is. And some people have a lot of conflict, or you'll literally be able to see people shake or their jawline tenses up. Like, we just, like you said, we just got to notice. We have to notice.
Well, so one thing I'd like to talk about or discuss sort of around this topic then is how much, back to this idea of self-reliance or resiliency, how much is it the role of the employer to really deal with our things, for example? So I mean, obviously it makes sense to be empathetic, and I like how you put it, that you must be great at relationships to be a good leader. I think that's critical. I think, developing trust, recognizing patterns just through having good relationships with people, all those are critical moments. And I think, obviously that's great, right? I assume the answer is somewhere there should be kind of a balance. But I wonder, how much of this should be things that we're working on our own, and trying to overcome versus, I guess, kind of standing around and waiting for someone else to notice.
That's a great question, Ryan. I think it's a really hard question because there's not a responsibility attached to the employer. You're really not, you're supposed to hire somebody and they're expected to fulfill their role, and that's it, right? But what we've learned so much about the brain and what we've learned so much about humanity is connection. And people thrive when they feel connected and trusted and valued. So if you're an employee and you don't feel valued and respected, then you're not going to want to perform for that person. You're just not. That is human behavior. We know this. That's motivation. So if you want value out of your employee, you're going to check in with them and you're going to provide the resources for them, not to take advantage of you and not to take advantage of the company. So it depends on the situation. It depends on the circumstance. It depends on so many factors. I don't know what the policies are with certain corporations and things, but it really comes back to connection and seeing that other people. And the other thing to that is strengths. Like, you have to check in and value your employees and look for their strengths and realize we're all not going to have the same strengths. So utilize that and build up your employees so that they'll want to work for you. That's my experience too. I mean, I've been around a lot of different leaders. It's in the education sector, but I can tell you who I wanted to work for and who I didn't. Yeah. And you get disheartened when you don't feel valued.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially, as an employee somewhere. I mean, of course, you want to feel good about the work you're doing. You want to feel valued by the people you're doing it for. So I think that all makes sense. One of the things I try and think about as it pertains to resiliency is this idea of sort of that we must take care of ourselves to some degree before we're able to help other people, right? So in order for us to show up for work, we need to do some of the work on our own. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about just sort of self-care and developing awareness. We talked a few moments ago about this idea of just sort of paying attention. But I wonder if you had any tips or any ideas for like how we might sort of, I guess, assess ourselves and understand our own strengths so that we can better maybe manage other people's expectations of us, and not to say that we should, belittling ourselves or bringing ourselves down in any way. But I think what I'm trying to get at is I think for some anyway, and maybe this isn't as broad as I think it might be, I feel like for a lot of us, maybe we don't even really know that we're acting in a different way because we've always acted that way, or we, I just wonder if there's something about this awareness of self or something to do with the way that we handle situations in life that could be brought to the forefront so we can better understand ourselves so that we're then better capable of, developing quality relationships with others.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think you were alluding to that probably with the last question about the responsibility, like whose responsibility is this? And my answer is always, it's a societal responsibility, because once you have information, you got to act on it. If you don't know what you don't know. And so you can't go back and start feeling terribly guilty. But to answer your question about the whole self-care, yeah, we know that, that word mindfulness is thrown out there so much, probably to a fault, but what we need to understand is the value of it. And so when you can teach yourself and train yourself to be mindful of, okay, oh my gosh, my chest is burning right now. I am tense. That means I'm going to start flipping out. And this can happen at work. This could happen in the grocery store. And we've seen that on the media lately too, with this whole wearing masks and not, but there's always a reason, right? With parenting, all of it. And we have to understand that in order to give our best selves to others, you have to be able to take care of yourself. I think there's a major problem with the work environment in Canada with regards to like new parents. For example, I live in Canada, so I got to have an entire year off with some pay to take care of my child. And in the States, I cannot believe that we do not value parents enough to do that. So little things like that aren't offered through the workforce, like that stuff has to change. And that's why remote working can be so valuable to some families. It can really connect families and eliminate a lot of the chaos that people are feeling. And I think if, like, to take care of yourself and be mindful of your own needs, the biggest piece to that is communication. So not only understanding that, look, things are changing. I have kids now. I have a family. I feel like I'm in chaos, but I really want to be a great employee. I think you've got to have an approachable manager who you can go and be honest about what's happening with you and say, look, this is my situation. I will show up better for your company if you allow me to work from home 3 days a week. And those are the 3 days that our family has chaos. And it would help me not to have to get to get my kids ready and to get myself ready and get out the door. I would do a much better job for you that day. And I think it's important now in this day and age, we start looking at how we can shift that for families. Our families, they're the backbone of our whole society, our families.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because I think one thing I've noticed in sort of the remote work advocacy that I've been doing is that a lot of people sort of assume that what we're looking for is that everyone must be remote and remote is the future. Everyone will be doing this and that's just the way we'll work in the future. Versus with the reality, or at least the way I see it, where it's got more to do with choice and flexibility. It's the ability to do what you need to do to be best able to show up. So I think the example you just used is a great one. And actually it's a little anecdotal. My wife is in education also. She teaches ninth grade honors English. And when everybody went remote, one observation that came up that was kind of interesting, I thought, was that some of her students who don't particularly thrive in the classroom, and are also seem to be sort of on the ADD, ADHD kind of spectrums, these kids seem to do really well working from home, or at least in a few instances. And, granted, this is purely anecdotal, but the point was that these kids were now allowed to work in a way that worked better for them than being in the traditional classroom. Maybe fewer distractions and no kids around, and they were maybe better able to focus on the screen versus all the things going on in the classroom, or whatever. I'm not a scientist. I don't really know why it worked, but we thought it was really an interesting thing that so many of her students that would normally struggle in the classroom were doing really well. And so I think that really drives home this point about the importance of flexibility and being able to do flexible work so that you can basically be the best employee you can be. One thing that occurs to me too, and there's actually like 3 or 4 things in what you're talking about I'd like to unpack a little bit.
Sure.
First of all, we circled around a little bit around this idea of trust or distrust and developing empathy as a leader and that sort of thing. So much about remote work has to do with trust. It's what keeps us from micromanaging. It keeps us from all these other things. And it's interesting. I've noticed as we're having this conversation, and I've been guilty of this in other conversations too, so now I'll try and be a little more aware. But, we're talking a lot about sort of, employer up here on this pedestal, and we're down here, the worker bee who's trying to serve this person. But what about their trauma? And what about their problems and how that's coming down as a leader? And so I wonder if we could sort of just talk about that a little bit and how a leader, who's maybe experienced some things on their own or is behaving in a certain way because of, childhood trauma or who knows, how can they become or start to develop more empathy and develop more trust in people, and maybe it goes back to relationships and connection, it all feels sort of interwoven.
It is. And I always say, look, I think our culture has been like, if you need mental health support, then you're weak. And I think we're getting much better at that. But if you're someone who's a leader, I think that is a problem that you internalize and think that, okay, I don't need this. I don't have to do this. I'll tell you, there was, and I won't go into too much detail, but I had to go to a women's shelter at one point in my life. And I was a professional, and it humbled me quite a bit. And it made me realize that I have so much in common with other people who aren't in a profession, who are here with me experiencing this. And it felt good to be a part of something other people got right. And so, yeah, there's probably a lot going on with our leaders because there's high pressure they have on externally, there's finances. You have no idea what they're going home to either, culturally, what's going on. So I think there's lots of tools out there for people to get that help. But I think one of the things, like I've partnered with, you can see I do a podcast called Advancing Humanity, and I've partnered with this company who does online, remote, virtual counseling. And I've been talking about it for a long time. So when they approached me, I was like, absolutely, I believe in this, because I did a ton of research to even show that, yes, online virtual mental health help is so crucial, because people can access it from the comfort of their home. They don't have to rush people off to other places. They can just be, the temperature's comfortable for them. They can get a snack if they need. There's no waiting room. You jump on. So I think for professionals, I think the online mental health support is really crucial to helping them get the care that they need, so that they don't have that stigma, but they can really access people online who are professional, who help them. I think that's one major piece here, because we need them to get the tools so they can be better leaders. And then again, normalizing this conversation. That's huge.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you say that, this idea of sort of online therapy or online counseling support, because, I've been in a therapist's office before, and I remember sitting in the waiting room waiting for my opportunity to go in and visit, and just kind of looking around the room and going, what's going on with that guy, or what's up with that guy, and like getting real out of my box and out of focusing on what I'm trying to work through or whatever, and starting to, and then I start going, well, God, what do they think of me, and what's that person thinking I'm here for, and blah, blah, blah. And it just kind of turns into this whole thing that's kind of yucky, really. And so now I do have sort of a perspective on virtual communications that is just that, if we picture our relationships or our communication as sort of like a glass of water that we're trying to fill to stay satiated. The idea is, maybe a text message is 1 or 2 drops, an email might be, a few ounces, a, phone call might be half a glass, maybe a Zoom call or something is 9/10 of a glass, but we're never quite fully satiated unless we have this opportunity to meet in person. And so I do think that there is some value to being able to look at the body language and look into the eyes and do all that kind of stuff in person. And so, but I think to your idea, and also as it goes forth with this analogy, you can survive on 90% of a glass of water for a long time. So maybe you need to be able to go see your therapist in person every so often, but to be able to have these regular check-ins to sort of keep your glass kind of full and steady, I think is terrific. And I think it's a great resource, especially now during work from home. I think most therapy practices have gone remote as well.
Yeah, they had to.
So whether you're using online platforms that, have built applications and all kinds of stuff around this, or whether you're just getting on the phone with your therapist via Zoom or whatever, I think it's a great opportunity to leverage technology as a way to sort of get the help you need in the comfort of your own home.
Yeah, as an option. And it goes back to what you said before. It may not be for everybody, but it's an option. And I think that leaders have that stigma of, I don't want anyone seeing me go into this office. So I just love that they have options, but it's not for everybody. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, well, and I think that there is so much to that stigma too. And I don't know if that there's a quick answer to this, but I wondered if you did have any thoughts about moving forward on that. I think so much about overcoming stigma is just normalizing it, making it part of our normal conversation. And, I sort of think about it or equate it to, a lot of people look at remote work as something somehow different than work. Where in my perspective, remote work is just work. It's, a way of working, maybe it's flexible, whatever, we need terms to describe it. Like that's how the language works. But at the same time, essentially what we're talking about is just work. And so, and I think that that's sort of the same, with this kind of thing is that, the conversation needs to be so open and so comfortable that these things just become so commonplace that it's like, well, of course, yeah, what else would it be? And so I wonder if you had sort of thoughts around, destigmatizing or how you could maybe do this in a workplace. I mean, you mentioned earlier on, and I think you're right, most people probably aren't going to unearth their childhood trauma in front of their boss or their peers, that kind of thing. You got to get pretty far down the relationship road before you're maybe ready to have those kinds of conversations. And honestly, maybe it's not the business of your employer. But, how do we then, understanding that some things should be personal and some things should be private, how do we balance that out in a workplace?
Yeah, I think you can't throw certain buzzwords around all the time. Like I know with the professional development we did, we constantly had mindfulness and we constantly said mental health. And I think the language we're using, it has to be varied because people just roll their eyes like, oh, here we go again. I think the other thing is if people informed about why they're getting certain training or talking about a certain idea, it would actually help them understand it. So like when we say, okay, here's more mindfulness, well, no, this is about like when you're really frustrated with your employee who showed up late to work again, this is when you're going to use this particular tool. And then they'll buy into it. It's about the buy-in to it. But even going back to what you're saying about the whole stigma and normalizing things, when people used to have cancer years and years ago, nobody talked about it. It was too hard to say. People were shamed. And apparently, I wasn't alive at that point, but that's the idea. And so with mental health, that's what we have to do. So when I teach about suicide, for example, people like shy away, oh, we can't talk about, yes, we need to say the word. We need to ask people who we're worried about, are you thinking suicide? And that's including employees if they're hearing certain things. I mean, employees should be getting trained in safe talk. It's a half a day's workshop where you can learn to hear keywords that people might be saying or doing, that you have that conversation. We need to do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think actually that sort of segues nicely into suicide and suicide intervention as a topic. It's something we haven't really broached on this particular podcast, maybe largely for that reason. It feels like one of those scary topics to bring up. But, and I hate it when sentences start with, in this time or in this difficult moment or whatever, as we're dealing with this pandemic. But I mean, most certainly people who are struggling with mental health conditions and who are having a really hard go right now, whether they're victims of external things like lost jobs and things like this, or whether it's internal problems from being left alone all the time or whatever, nonetheless, suicide might start seeming like an option for some people. And I anticipate, and I don't know if there's any evidence to back it yet, but I would anticipate that there might be a little bit of a lift in suicide, given what's happening around the world right now, and this, constant barrage of what feels like, just terror happening all around. This killer COVID is out lurking in the corners to get us. And, I mean, how do you live a very happy and productive life when you're afraid that something's out to get you all the time? And so I think that, for people who are susceptible, which I guess, could be anyone, I imagine that there's definitely a rise in suicidal tendencies or thoughts. And so I wonder if you talk just maybe a little more in depth, first of all, things that we can do, how we might recognize this, maybe recognizing some of the patterns or the things coming down the pipe that might sort of end or culminate in these kinds of ideas. And then also, if we're witnessing it or seeing it in other people, what sorts of things could we watch out for and how can we offer them help?
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the employer. First of all, if we're talking about work and remote work, if people feel like they don't have an option, you're absolutely right. They're going to start thinking this is my only option. And so if you can, don't forget, it's not just the pandemic, as you know, it's the economy. It's the economy. People are really struggling out there. I mean, I walk by restaurants and I think, oh my gosh, this restaurant just opened up. Can you imagine the person who had their life savings who put that into this restaurant and then they don't get to have people in it? It's crushing in so many different sectors. So if you can give options to your employees to help them settle in, which might change their whole life, to give them the options, maybe that won't happen, right? If someone's thinking about it. The other thing is people do think that they're unburdening other people when they do think suicide. So if you think that it's a selfish act, actually people who are suicidal think they're really thinking of other people, that they're a burden and they're trying to lift that. And so it's important that we have the conversations around it. Some things that people do when they're suicidal is they start giving their important valuables away to other people. They start using language like they're not going to be here. They'll say things like it's hopeless. They might actually say, oh, I just want to kill myself. And sometimes we say that in jest and in passing, but sometimes people are saying that so that somebody will react. So there's a guy named Kevin Hines that a lot of people have probably heard of. He's the guy who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. And he later said, because he's all over the internet, you can find him, you should listen to what he says. He said, I was riding the bus on the way to the Golden Gate Bridge, knowing I was going to jump, knowing I was going to kill myself. I was just waiting for someone to ask me if I was okay. And if we just acknowledge people and say, look, are you okay? People are going to say, yeah, I'm fine. But if you know them, you know their patterns. If there's a shift there, being further isolated is the worst. So we have to connect with other people. The connections are what's going to keep all of us alive and thriving, not just alive, but thriving. So we've got to connect.
Yeah, no, I think that that's critical. And it's funny because, I've heard his story and others like it, where, it's not often a lot that it takes to push them the other direction, instead of off the bridge to keep them on it. And, and it usually is just that, it's somebody taking, investing time or energy in them, that all of a sudden they care. And I think an interesting point you brought up was this idea of options. We do get, and especially now, where it just feels like the world is sort of crushing us and there's no escape. I mean, I've been lucky enough that, I work for myself and I've been lucky enough to stay afloat throughout this. But, I know for a lot of people, my clients included, it's not going so well. And, I could understand or could empathize how it could easily get into this situation where it's like, well, God, there's no way out. Where do I go? This is it. And really become narrowly focused on this. So I love the idea of sort of introducing options. And as an employer, I think that's really critical. I think it's easy for a remote worker to sort of hide in the shadows a little bit and maybe become less communicative, or maybe they're just not as participative in different, online chats or whatever you're doing as a remote worker. And I think that it might be easier for them versus when you're in a traditional office setting. Maybe you see Sally every day and you can clearly see that Sally has stopped doing her hair or whatever, like you might be able to recognize something that's very superficial and understand that is an indicator of a bigger problem. But I think for remote workers, you might have to be even more perceptive, if these people you don't see often or you don't see at all, in a lot of cases, these people never come into the office or you may never meet them in person really. And, so it might be a little tougher to read some of the facial cues or the intonation when you ask if they're okay and they go, oh yeah, I'm great, or whatever, you might have a hard time reading that in a text message or something. And
Brian, sorry. Well, what I was going to say to that is, so if somebody's thriving and doing really well as a remote worker, that's great to continue. You can still do something outside of work so that you can meet up socially that engages the relationship, that engages that team environment, because you have to have the team building. That's really helpful too. If you still connect with them, and seeing each other's faces and making eye contact and saying people's names, for crying out loud, makes people feel seen and valued. So we can still do that just outside of work, and then make it easy for the person to get there. And that way you can still have that connection. Yeah.
And I often think of it too, in that, I don't feel like I should have to rely on my employer for my social, for example. Right. So now granted, I have remote workers, but maybe they're all over the planet, right? So maybe I can't physically go meet one of my coworkers for lunch or something. But by maintaining connection with other people and keeping up social groups and developing relationships outside of work, then you still have an escape. Even if work is hard, you have a place to go afterwards. You can go meet somebody for coffee when you get off shift or whatever it is. And so I think it's an important point, this idea that whether you're getting it from your employer, whether you're getting it from a coworker, whether you're getting it from a friend or family member or whatever, it is critical to spend some time just getting out of your head, getting out of work, getting out of this. And I know in my personal experience, I spent essentially my 20s working nose down in my own office by myself, 14, 16 hours a day. But I had a little bit of a release, or I didn't realize how big a problem it was, because when I got home, I had been married. I had a young kid at that point. And so, it was really easy for me to maintain this pattern of work where I was really just killing myself, working a lot of hours. And so, but, I felt like I was doing okay. I had this noble vision that I was doing all this work because I had to, raise money for a family. And then I got to go home and see the family after work. And so it sort of, I guess, took the edge off, right? It made me unaware of how bad it was for me to work so much. And, it really wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago that I was able to sort of change that behavior. And, so I think and this is a problem really common with remote workers, is boundary setting and being able to sort of break away, at a given time. It's not like, going to the factory where you punch the clock at 8 and you leave at 5 and, that kind of thing. Really, especially if you're in a flexible working environment, you can come and go as you please and work as regularly as often, as you choose based on, what you need to get done. And things do kind of get out of hand. And for me, that's what led to these feelings of isolation and these feelings of, sort of depression or sort of these dark thoughts where what am I doing? I'm just spending all this time. I'm not, not advancing in my career. I just work for myself. So I'm not getting external gratification of moving up the chain somewhere. I mean, so for me, it was that overwork and that sort of burnout that contributed to my sort of, mental health type stuff, sort of my more dark feelings that I was having. And so I think it's really critical that we start to pay attention to those sorts of things. I mean, luckily mine were never dark enough that I was feeling suicided, but but for a lot of people, maybe it is. And so I think it's really important to recognize that. I guess then to sort of take that to the next step, what can we do for like intervention? Like, so let's say we've noticed that our coworker is, disheveled or has a negative attitude or has changed something. There's a change that we recognize as maybe leading towards this path. How do we help them find the help they need? Because, back to our earlier conversation, I think so much of this, like some of it is external, and I think you've made the point, and we, discussed the idea that, by just addressing somebody, that can sure be helpful. But I also think that it is a very personal decision to decide to do that kind of thing. And ultimately, you've got to get into the place to do it. Because I don't think most people, are in a situation where mentally it's even an option on the table. And so I think that there's got to be something about, allowing these people, I guess, the latitude to care for themselves or give them the resources they need so that they can sort of fix the problems internally. And, in addition to the sort of external, feedback or gratification that they can get.
Yeah, I mean, that there's so much to that, because where my mind goes is how complex it is about what system are you in? What are the constraints of the system that you work within? What's your building like? And what's the interaction among people? Are people disenfranchised? Do people believe in the product and the service? Do people have integrity? Do they get to work with integrity? And so there's so many pieces to that, because they're going to feel more a part of something good and better, and they're going to be more receptive to you if you provided that on the foundation for that in that environment. So if they don't respect you, for example, and you approach them, they're not going to respond to you. Mm-hmm. But if you've developed that rapport and that relationship genuinely, then you'll be able to have conversations with them that are truly caring conversations. And sometimes it's about softening the voice, looking someone in the eyes, and just letting them know that they're important and seen and valued. And I can't say that enough, because there's so many people who are showing up at the workplace who do not feel that way. Mm-hmm. And do not feel like they're working with integrity. So if they have other things that aren't working for them outside of work, and they show up to that every day, well, that's more toxic to them. Yeah. And they're more disengaged from work than they are their relationships elsewhere. Sure.
Well, so, I mean, so is it okay though to, I don't know, when do you bring in law enforcement or medical professionals, or like, I mean, is that our job? Should we be calling the therapist on behalf of person who we think may have problem? Or, how much of that needs to be on them versus like, when is it okay for us to intervene or get serious? I mean, I guess, in my mind, if there's a tangible threat, if they're saying, well, this is it, this weekend I'm toast, that kind of thing, then okay, maybe you need to intervene in a more physical way. Maybe there's, hey, no, we need to go to the movie Saturday night. What are we doing? Oh, okay. But should we be calling help on behalf of people like this? Or is it better to just do what we can do in terms of nurturing the relationship, but ultimately it's up to them?
I think we need to make sure we just continue to care about people. And if that means calling a service to help them out that's outside of work, then absolutely. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I send someone home and I think that they might be suicidal, I can't sleep. And maybe that's because of what I do, and likely. And there's a lot of people who are employees are like, listen, this is not my job. I didn't sign up for this. And I understand that. But I think we need to, I think we need a list of social community services that are out there, just a list with phone numbers. And there's crisis line numbers, because what you can do is, are you kidding me? There's tons of times where I had students come to me and I had to make sure that I connected them with somebody else before I could go home and sleep at night. But there's also those people who come to me and you don't really know what's going to happen, and you have to shuffle them out the door anyway, or you're sending them to a very abusive household and social services is already involved and you can't do anything about that. Yeah. So there's a lot of layers there, and self-care for your own self so you can show up to people better is important. But I think leaders really should get training. I think you need more training in mental health so that it's very specific. Like, how hard would it be if you think someone might be suicidal and you're working with them and you say, can I sit with you so we can call this number together? Or here's a number, a crisis line, and just have it so it's quick and easy, because, we're not always at our best either. I think we need to just have that awareness and have some resources that you can at least give them to do. And you're right. Ultimately, adults have to make those decisions too. I mean, people who show up to get counseling, I can't make them want to get better. There's a whole thing that we do to assess whether they're in the mindset to even get better. People who work with addiction, they're not always ready to get better. They've been mandated by the court to be there. Do you think they want to get better and you're going to do much about it that session? So I understand what you're saying. It's really challenging.
Yeah, it's pretty murky. I don't know that there is an answer. So sorry to put you on the spot like that. But I think it's important to at least recognize that stuff. And especially from your perspective, I know at least here in the States and presumably everywhere, teachers have a moral or a ethical obligation that if, a student comes and says something, you must pass that on to a counselor or to, law enforcement or whomever, depending on the nature of the threat or nature of the concern. And so, as an educator, you've got that sort of inborn, ethos that you must, do something, like it's sort of on you to do something. But yeah, of course, especially as we've talked work from home and kids being sent home for, because of COVID, and they're now doing school at home. Not everybody's home is great. Not everybody's got a great place to go work, and maybe they don't want to be around their alcoholic dad the whole time, and school was an escape. So it really is unfortunate because, at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do, as much as you want to empathize for everyone and be there for everyone. There's, physical capabilities that we're just not capable of, really doing everything for everyone, which is unfortunate. But I think having awareness and doing what you can when you can is critical. And maybe that's sort of the point. Let's talk a little bit and sort of shift off this, and we'll get a little bit lighter. So one of the things I sort of wanted to discuss, and I think as it pertains to education, you can talk about this, but also as it pertains to remote learning and work, is this new sudden work from home movement. I've sort of been toying with this idea or this theory that mental health problems that were always a struggle for remote workers, these ideas of depression and isolation, that, there's 4 or 5 on the checklist that seem to be stuff that are very commonly experienced by remote workers, are something that people who choose to go into remote work are sort of prepared for. Like, they say, I won't feel that way or whatever, but at least they have some awareness that these things exist in the remote work world if they've done any kind of research, as they've decided to get into remote. And so, but one thing or one observation I've had is during COVID and all of a sudden this rush to work from home, all of a sudden a lot of people who had no interest or no concerns or no whatever for working remote and don't presently have any interest in working remote and are just counting down the minutes till they can get back to their office, I feel like they might be even more susceptible to these issues of mental health. And, it's funny, you were talking a little bit about just having the kids at home and working from home and stuff. And I've been cracking this joke since work from home started, that basically, my biggest problem since work from home is my new coworkers, meaning my 2 sons and my wife. And, and actually we inherited a third kid, a kid that plays for my son's softball or football team, came over here for the last 3 weeks of school too, because he was behind. For me, it created this different dynamic. Yes, in one sense, it was great because I got to spend more time with my kids more than ever because, normally I'm working and they're at school and we just kind of live our own lives and do our own things just to reunite, around the dinner table or whatever. But during work from home, it's been kind of a different thing, but like some of the things or the steps, and maybe you have more you can add to this, for people who aren't necessarily accustomed to work from home and maybe haven't sort of set themselves up in a way to do so, I wonder if you had any ideas about how they might thrive, sort of despite being forced into a situation they don't know. And, like one example of this that we applied with our children was, we stuck to a really regimented schedule. So for example, our kids kept the same bell schedule they had at school when they went to work from home. So when they came to the house, basically they got up at the same time, they went to class at the same time, they logged in and did their, courses in the same order that they did them at school and all this stuff. And, granted, they were able to rocket through stuff a lot quicker than they could in a school day. Instead of burning 8 hours, they were done by noon or 1. And, for our boys, it worked really well. And it didn't hurt that, I have some experience in remote work and my wife is an educator who sat right in between them. So, I mean, between the two of us, we were really able to give our kids kind of a leg up during this stuff. So they actually thrived and did quite well. I know that's not the case for many, though. And so, but I wondered if you had thoughts, about, now you're stuck, you're working from home, how can you thrive, or how can you be productive, and how can you maintain these, different aspects of your life to keep your sort of mental well-being in check?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand your own scenario and not try to be, how many people put how amazing they are as a mother or a parent on Facebook, and then you're like, oh my gosh, I can't possibly be like that. I think we've got to stop comparing ourselves to what others can do and think about what your needs at home are, and then think about how you might be able to be flexible. So I'm an educator too. I did not work well with my kids. I have a 7, 9, and then I have a 16-year-old. He did fine. My 7-year-old wasn't going to have me sitting with him, teaching him. I'm his mom. I'm not his teacher. Very different relationship. So I had to readjust that. It took about a month to find the right kind of schedule or the right mindset. But I taught teenagers. So I was able to, they're not emailing me till 12 at night or 2 in the morning or 8 p.m. So I decided to shift what I was doing to meet my family needs and my sanity, to be a parent in the day, do the best we could. And the expectations had to shift, went grocery shopping, did all that. And then I addressed my student needs at night. And then sometimes I got up really early and graded the work then, because I could, and it was easier for me. And I didn't have the kids bugging me when I'm trying to concentrate. Mm-hmm. So that worked for me. So I think you have to think of your own needs and what will actually make you thrive, rather than trying to do what other people are imposing on you, and try to negotiate that with your employer. If you can, we were told at one point that we weren't supposed to leave our house till 2 p.m. or 2:10, because that's when our bell at school would have ended. And I'm like, I got kids here all day. No, that's not going to work. And I'll address my student needs when I can best address their needs. And I did great, but I had to adjust my home life too. So I think you have to think about individual needs and try to find out how to rally the people around you to support that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think that, so much of, working for a company or whatever is, especially when you have to be somewhere at a certain time or check in or out, at a certain time, it becomes pretty easy to develop a routine. But it is easy, or I guess it's nice. It's one of the perks of sort of being able to work in a flexible way, is that you can sort of, refactor your life to work in the way that you need it to work. So it's a good example that you're sharing how, you were able to shift your work day so that you could best serve your family and also best serve your students. That was sort of the case with us, except for we, like I said, we were doing the bell schedule, and my wife teaches junior high kids. So she's got sort of preteens and teenagers. And these kids, same thing, the emails come in at all hours and all that stuff. But what happened for my wife, that was a real problem, was setting clear boundaries. Our boys are 13 and 9. And have both been lucky enough to have come through a Microsoft technology school for elementary school. And so when we went fully online, they already knew the tools. They know how to log themselves in. They know how to do all the work themselves. So they were actually quite autonomous. Even our 3rd grader was, very, very capable of just logging in and doing his whole day's work with very little supervision. So we were pretty lucky in that sense. My wife, on the other hand, my kids would bail at noon and they would go do their thing. But my wife would basically work like 8 in the morning to 8 or 9 at night, because she was fielding every email and fielding every, message and, trying to build curriculum for the next day and all this stuff, and I know in our school district in particular, I think they were set up at a little bit of a disadvantage, because they had set some ground rules that they basically weren't going to count this term towards your grade. So you could either do really well, and if you did, that would go towards your grade. But if you didn't, and that you just wanted to take kind of a pass or fail, or, an incomplete, and then make it up over the summer or whatever, you could do that. And so she had almost 25 or 30% of her students, from her 250 students that she sees every day, almost 30% of those kids didn't even log in online once. And so those kids, whether, it's family, and, these are probably some of the more difficult families and the harder homes where the kids don't have parental support, those guys really suffered, and now basically they're on summer vacation and, presuming, fingers crossed that we go back to work or back to school in the fall. in some sort of normal way, those kids will have effectively had 9 months of no school, or 6 months, of no school. And so it's going to be, really difficult for teachers to step back into the classroom and now have all this ground to make up, the, a whole term that was missed that was supposed to set them up for 9th grade honors. And, instead they're, way behind. So I think it'll be really interesting, but I think your point anyway about sort of routine and being flexible, I think is really critical. And, I like to think, I talk a lot about routine, and for me, mine's pretty regimented. I like to get up and on time and work on time and dress on time, and, all these things. But I've talked to a lot of people, digital nomads and people who travel the world while they work and that kind of thing. And, routine comes in all shapes and sizes. So to your point about flexibility, I think that's a critical thing.
Yeah, and it can change. It can change daily too. Sometimes you've got a lot more energy and want to engage with your kids that day and do games and sports, and then the next day you're kind of done. So you might shift the way that schedule would have worked.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point too, because there's so many of us, myself included, that, if I don't do things on routine in the right way, then I feel this sense of shame or disappointment that I didn't get my thing done like when I was supposed to. And so I get really rigid, and it actually kind of, I'm constantly playing mind games to try and stay on track so that I can get things done when they're supposed to be done. Because if I don't do it in this way, then I don't feel like I had a good day. Right. And so I struggle a lot with that. So that's why I have such a rigid routine. But, like with so many other things, and it's come up on other episodes of this podcast where, like, even as it pertains to therapy and things like that, like a therapy practice doesn't mean you have to go in every 3 days a week for the rest of your life or whatever. It's not this all or nothing game. Maybe now you're experiencing a problem and you'd like to talk to somebody. So go ahead, talk to somebody. Maybe you take a year off, and then when something else arises, you go and have another conversation. I think it can be all things. So routine doesn't necessarily mean, 1, 2, 3 in this order all the time. I think sometimes it can be 1, then a break, and then come back to 2, and then 3 tomorrow, or whatever. Whatever your routine means to you, I think is, a good way to look at it.
Yeah, it's a good point, for sure.
Yeah. So as we're winding down here at the end, can you give us just some parting shots and let people know where they can find you online, where they can learn more about the work you're doing, and how they can get involved with you?
Well, thanks for that opportunity. Yeah, you know what? I think most of us have the goal in mind that we just want people to have a good life. And I think if we all stick together, we can do that. And that's what this podcast is that I've decided to do. It's about advancing humanity, but it's through connection, health, and innovation. And that's how I think we're going to thrive. So if anyone would like to listen to that, anywhere you listen to your podcast, just type in Advancing Humanity. We just hit our 50th episode today and we just released in March.
Congrats, that's huge.
Thank you. It's very exciting. I have so many people that I got to meet through this. So we all have the same goal, right? And our website, advancingHumanityPodcast.com. And I do want to tell people, and I did partner, like I said, with BetterHelp, but they'll give you a 10% discount if you go to betterhelp.com/advancinghumanity. And I really do believe in the service of people being able to get the help that they need, or somebody else that they love. There's support out there. And I just think we all just need to just do our best to stay connected and help each other out.
Yeah, I think that's terrific. So one last thing, this is sort of our closer. What is one thing that an employer can do or take away to see impactful change in the way that they're taking care of the mental health of their teams? And also conversely, what is one thing that a remote worker can do to make sure that their own mental health needs are met?
I would absolutely say training. I think leaders and employers need to get specialized training in more mental health. So they need to start funding or using their funds better to understand how to engage with their employees better and recognize those signs and symptoms of mental health on their team. It'll be very specialized. I think they need to do that. They invest in that. And I think remote workers, I think they need to communicate what they need and really think about what will benefit them, but also to the employer, because they're never going to make changes with their employer unless they can benefit their employer. So thinking about what they need to do a better job and how that will benefit the service or business that they're in.
I think that's perfect. Well, thank you so much, Charlie. I really appreciate your time. Everybody do check out the Advancing Humanity podcast. That's awesome. I'm really thrilled for you that you made 50 episodes. So many podcasters bail out so much sooner than that. So I'm grateful to see you putting in the work and doing it, because it's just awesome. And I think you're doing great work over there. So that's advancinghumanitypodcast.com. And thanks so much, Charlie. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I appreciate it too.